Hello viewers, here is a Holmes box VN. This is a 20-inch model from the 90s, and the model number is unknown. I don't know what the model number is. I don't see any informations. Oh, there's something on the motor. It says, well, there's a model number there, but I don't think it's the model number of the VN. I think it's the model number of the motor. See if I can get it on film here. It says top, but it's on the bottom. And since the oil port is facing down, I think the motor is definitely installed backwards or upside down. So there's the informations tag. 2.1 amps, and there's the date code, April of 1996. So this is, I guess it would have, maybe it would have had some kind of feet. I don't see how they would slide on, but it is evident that it would have had feet at some point and they broke off, as they typically do, because a little piece of plastic is not going to support the weight of a 20-inch fan. These were the beginning of the cheap VNs. It's kind of interesting because they cheapened out in different ways than what they do today. We still have the full-size shaded pole motor, which I'm not sure if that's a Macmillan motor or if it's a Raider motor. I know that Holmes has a tendency to use Raider motors. It certainly looks to me like a Macmillan motor, but it's a very generic looking design, and I think it could be either one. Maybe Tori, you could tell me if it's a Macmillan or a Raider motor. And these motors are debatable because these were not flawless motors. They are known to fail eventually. I think that people have like this phobia to PSC motors that's kind of unnecessary and uncalled for because of the physical size. And I think it's a lack of education, really, because the fans that came in the 2000s, a lot of the box fans, were using the physically smaller motor rated at a lower power draw, but what people weren't taking into account, or what it seems to me like they weren't taking into account, was that the motor was shifting from the shaded pole design as seen here, which is highly inefficient, to the much more efficient permanent split capacitor design. And so when you have a motor that's low efficiency that draws 2.1 amps, and then you switch to a motor that's high efficiency that only pulls 1.1 amps, for instance, you're not necessarily working with a reduction in performance. I think the use of a PSC motor, providing it's a good quality, properly built motor, is one of the very few instances where you can increase energy efficiency and not trade in quality, performance, and longevity and reliability. Because capacitors, for what it's worth, if they're built correctly, do not fail very often. There's plenty of capacitors built in the 1970s and the 1980s that are still running perfectly fine to this day. That's not at all uncommon. In fact, I would say it's uncommon to come across a capacitor fan from the 80s that has a bad capacitor. I've never encountered that. It's very, very rare. So anyways, I think people need to get over the PSC motor phobia and accept that the use of a smaller PSC motor is not intrinsically cheap or bad. It's just a different way of cheapening out. This fan is cheapened out in a number of ways. Well, for starters, there's no real handle to speak of. There's a little indentation up here, which is kind of useless. And you have this here, which I don't really trust because I think it could break any soon. And I mean, it's terrible to hold it because you're pretty much holding it right up against here, which is going to break. So I mean, this is terrible. The handle is awful, and the cabinet it's thinner than older models. It's not as thin as the one sold today, but it's thin enough that they were concerned about it tipping over, so they put the stinking feet on there. And in order to save, I don't know, the cost of drilling a hole in the top, they put the switch on the front and used this very crummy ink to label it, which is now worn off. So this is very cheap. This fan is cheap in a lot of ways. In comparison to fans like the Lasco 3733, for example, they cheapen out on the blade set and the stupid thin cabinet, but they decided to keep a handle on the switch on top with a proper handle, albeit that handle tends to break, but at least it's there. So I guess the case in point is one can argue that these were some of the last like really good box fans, but I'm not sure I would make that argument because these were very, very cheap in their own way. I would say these are almost as cheap as the ones we have today, just in different ways. So this stupid rotating guard on it, I think this is supposed to move with the breeze, but it's so hard to turn. I can't imagine that it would be able to turn from the draft of the fan. These blade sets were an absolute aerodynamic disaster, which is a common trend with Holmes products from the era. I don't know if they had a pile of bricks working in the R&D department, but the blades just make absolutely no sense. Can't really peep the hub too well. Can't really see in there at all. Oh, maybe we can do this. Yeah. Oh, it's just a press fit blade, which is Tipican. The reason I got this fan, it showed up at the Goodwill, which is kind of unusual for something really worth getting to show up at the Goodwill, but it showed up at the Goodwill, and I thought it was interesting because there is a variant of these Holmes box fans that is very much a childhood fan to me. I found one somewhere in here. I don't know where it is. I'll find it when I move out, but there was a version of this fan that didn't have the funny guard, and the blade was white, and it was in one of my middle school classrooms. So this is going back to the 2000s, and even at that age, not really knowing a whole lot about fans, even at that age I picked up on how stupid the blade design was and thought that it just made absolutely no sense, because the blades don't scoop towards the airflow, they kind of scoop away from it, and so it's almost like it would probably move more air running in reverse. It's not a reversible motor, but I tend to think it would move more air going in the other direction. And it's relatively easy to reverse the motor in one of these. You just take the stator out and put it in backwards, which does not affect the longevity of the motor. In fact, it has zero relevance to the longevity or build quality of the motor. In many ways, it would make the fan run backwards, and then we could see if it does change the airflow at all. Really, actually kind of intrigued to do that now. I'm going to have to do that one day. This one, I need to clean and service it still. It's pretty dusty, so perhaps when I do so, I will reverse the stator and see what transpires. Anyways, let's go ahead and plug this thing up. It has a 2-prong polarized plug with no funny views. It's powered on. We are looking at 119.9 volts. Now we're at 120 on the nose. Go over to amps because that's what the power rating is on the tag in. And it's on this fan. Something's wrong with the tripod. Yeah, one of the legs was not out all the way. Now it's flat. Okay. Oh, on it now. We'll start off on the low. Oh, the switch is like really cheap. And it appears that the bearings may be kind of locked up on this thing. And the blade is like, it is so out of clock, it's pathetic. I'll off it for a second so you can see. Look at that, oh my gosh. That's ridiculous. The blade is totally out of whack. The switch, it doesn't move very far. To me, it just feels very cheap. So this is drawing 0.7 amps on the low, which is more than less than I would have thought it would draw in low. Is it not a shaded pole motor? I don't see no capacitor in there. It looks like a shaded pole motor to me. It's upside down, but it doesn't change the kind of motor it is. And the airflow is just pitiful. Now I happen to like a slow, quiet, low speed, and so for me, I kind of like it this way. But for a 20-inch fan, it should move more air. Watts are 58, and the power factor is 0.72. So it is a shaded pole motor for sure. Okay, let's go to the medium. This is kind of angled ever so slightly, so you probably could somewhat adjust the angle of the airflow. And in fact, it does feel like it makes somewhat of a difference at directing the airflow. Not substantially, but it does do something. Okay, here's the medium. It's already starting to shake horrifically. It's pretty substantially out of balance. It's drawing 1.08 amps, the watts is 97, and the power factor is 0.75. And the airflow is kind of interesting. It's very slow. It's very low velocity airflow, but it's extremely steady. And it almost kind of feels like it's a decent volume to it. It's very smooth and steady airflow. I find it very pleasant. I still think this blade is an aerodynamic disaster, but I guess it's working okay. You know, the breeze is picking up, but it's still extremely below average for a box Fiat. 20-inch box Fiat. Okay, let's go to the high. I don't think it'll fall over. Let's see. No, it's nowhere near trying to fall over. Something's loose somewhere in there. And the blade is pretty far out of whack. This is nowhere near having enough air moving it to turn that by itself. But I can feel now that it is making a pretty big difference as far as where it directs the airflow to. I guess that's kind of useful. And now it's still below average for a box fan, but the airflow isn't terrible on high. It moves air like a cheap fan, because that's what it is. On high, it's 1.99 amps, so it's right around where it should be. 182 watts, and the power factor is 0.76. Yeah, actually, that card is pretty effective directing the airflow. It doesn't seem like it would be because the slats have a very slight angle to them, but it is effective. I don't know what that annoying rattling sound is. If it wasn't for all that rattling or that vibration or whatever you want to call it, it wouldn't be horrifically loud. It's definitely out of balance, but it's not quite out of balance as I thought it would be, considering how badly the blade is out of clock. So it's not a terrible fan, but it's definitely cheap. Let's try to low again now that the furnace is off. Yeah, it does have a pretty nice quiet low to it, which is definitely something that I prefer. I don't think that it really has much of a startup sounds to it, but we'll take a quick listen in case it does. So here's the low. I hear any startup sound. Okay. Well, and that will be it for this one. I've had this for a while and I still have yet to get around to cleaning and servicing it, so hopefully soon I will get around to cleaning and servicing it.